Shalom. I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz. I'm the Rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia, speaking to you from the pulpit of our synagogue. At this time, I'd like to speak on the subject, when suffering is prolonged. When suffering is prolonged. Our national mood is bittersweet. 3 Israeli hostages have come home, and we are very thankful for their deliverance. The captivity of the other 95 or so continues. 30 of them scheduled to be released over the upcoming nearly 6 weeks, and fully 2/3 of the hostages still suffering in conditions we can hardly comprehend. Even after all this time and all the delay built into the process now, the return of those among them still living is very far from a sure thing. A verse from our biblical reading last Sabbath comes to mind, Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Long after the Pharaoh died, and the children of Israel groaned from the bondage and cried out, and their plea from the bondage went up to God. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. The rabbis gave due weight to the force of raising one's voice in outcry. One of their famous statements, contained in the discussion of Rosh Hashanah, the day of divine judgment, contains a list of what could, quote, tear up a negative decree, what could cancel an adverse divine judgment. And this list included the act of crying out. Talmud Tractate Rosh Hashanah, page 16b. Rabbi Isaac said, a person's sentence is torn up on account of 4 types of actions. These are giving charity, crying out in prayer, a change of one's name, and a change of one's deeds for the better. Rabbi Isaac's list is not comprehensive. It deals with what are perceived to be divine decrees rather than the threats emanating from wicked people. But before extending his teaching, let us understand it. I believe there's a wrong way to understand his words and a right way. The wrong way is to think that there is some mechanical force, some necessary cause and effect to his recommendations, as if human destiny were reducible to a law of nature. If these 4 actions worked like magic, then, quote, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Shakespeare's Hamlet, would no longer bedevil the lives of all of us mortals. That indeed is one of the most difficult conclusions to internalize, that we cannot solve the reverses of being human in some sort of deterministic fashion. In short, religion does not work like magic. Magical thinking is the mark of the immature mind. Surely, we've all witnessed the frustration and even the rage of the child who was thwarted in some desire, even after having said, quote, pretty please with a cherry on top, or whatever other words they've been misled into believing would work like magic. Just as there is immature thinking, so too there is immature religion. Immature religion indulges immature thinking and perpetuates it. We may fancy ourselves too sophisticated to lapse into that, but stresses can cause us to regress, and then in our immaturity, we talk to God in childish ways. We know the famous joke of the woman walking with her child on the jetty when a rogue wave washed her beloved into the ocean. She vows a life of unbroken piety if only God will restore her little one, Then, when another freak wave casts the child onto the dry ground, she suddenly changes her tone and, pointing an accusing finger to heaven, she says, "God, and what about the hat he was wearing?" Underlying the joke, though, is the bargaining to which we are apt to regress when confronted with a grave diagnosis or some other existential setback. If that is the wrong way to understand the rabbinic catalog of how to respond to what feels like a sentence from heaven, what is the right way? The rabbis are telling us that we always need to do what we can. As for outcry, suffering in silence may have a certain nobility under specific circumstances, but outcry can mobilize all who hear. If a human has not been socialized to be a bigot, denying the humanity of the other, and if he has not murdered his own capacity to hear or see the pain of the person whose suffering has intersected with his life path, then the outcry has at least the possibility of awakening a compassionate response. As for philanthropy, it may or may not save the giver from an adverse divine decree, but it helps the recipient and advances the concretizing of a society where people help each other. I understand the concept of a change of name as a change of one's reputation. Do you think we have only one name? The Israeli poet Zelda taught us that a person has many names. Some of them are conferred by external forces. Some of them are the result of our interaction with our environment. And some of them are a reflection of our character. Here's her poem. Each of us has a name. Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. Change of name. Change of destiny. What is the book on you? What is the name given by the record of your deeds? Is that name worthy of your best self? If not, can you change your name? Which leads to the final item of the rabbinic catalog. A successful change of one's behavior for the better is tantamount to a change of that name. Think of the re-signification of the famous scarlet letter at the end of Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel. Hester Prynne still wore it, but it no longer represented the closed-off case of sin and punishment by way of shaming. Quoting from the conclusion of the novel. But there was a more real life for Hester Prynne here in New England. Here had been her sin, here her sorrow, and here was yet to be her penitence. She had returned, therefore, and resumed the symbol of which we have related so dark a tale. Never afterwards did it quit her bosom, but in the lapse of the toilsome, thoughtful, and self-devoted years that made up Hester's life, the scarlet letter ceased to be a stigma which attracted the world's scorn and bitterness, and became a type of something to be sorrowed over and looked upon with awe, yet with reverence too. As I mentioned earlier, after all these four rabbinic responses have been tallied, we must acknowledge that there is another one, deeply rooted in Judaism, omitted in the rabbinic list because of the Rosh Hashanah context of their words. They were speaking of situations where we are facing what felt like a decree from heaven. In other words, where there is no ability to confront the human source of the evil decree directly. But in Israel's current predicament, those who wish it evil, who wish to do it harm, are human agents. Israel has the obligation and the full justification to protect itself against those who wish to murder Israelis and Jews. The obligation and the full justification to weaken the League of Terrorists and anti-Semites who even now do not afford our people the simple recognition that we have the right to be a nation among the nations of the world. The obligation and the full justification to practice self-defense. In that case, why have I devoted a full measure of space to the rabbinic list? Because in practicing legitimate self-defense, Israelis need to be careful not to lose the exquisite Jewish sense of being a light unto the nations. A reminder that even when peace does not seem at hand, the dream of peace must be kept alive. We need to defend the body of our nation, but also not to lose our soul in the process. It is an unending task, made far more difficult by the inhumanity shown us by our enemies and the apathy of too much of the world. But it is a task that we must not abandon. To quote another of the famous rabbis, "Ours is not to complete the work, but we are not free to desist from it." Shalom.